Hi everyone and welcome. I'm Katie Koullas, CEO of Yellow Ladybugs, and in the spirit of reconciliation, Yellow Ladybugs acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Welcome to this panel discussion dedicated to helping autistic girls and gender diverse young people navigate the complex world of sexual identity, and with a specific focus on the autistic young people that also identify as part of the LGBTQIA+ community. Before going any further, I have a short content note about today's panel. While our aim is to have a discussion that is accessible for autistic teens and young people, parental discretion is recommended, and parents, carers in our audience may prefer to watch this panel before deciding whether it's appropriate for their tweens or teens in their care. Topics for discussion may include references to sexual violence and abuse, references to poor mental health, self-harm or suicidal ideation, discussion about different gender identities, expressions, sexuality and queer culture. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And so let's get started. As once again, it's fantastic to be bringing a live audience together with three speakers who have such a wealth of lived experience, knowledge and expertise to share with us. A big welcome to all our parents and carers and teachers and allied health professionals who are looking to support autistic girls and gender diverse young people, and to all our neurokin who are tuning in again, welcome and the warmest of welcomes to you today. Thank you again to the Department of Education and Training Victoria for sponsoring this event, which has allowed us to deliver this important event for free. Yellow Ladybugs has long been advocating for how important it is that autistic youth, and especially girls and gender diverse young people, have access to appropriately tailored information about a range of topics, including sexuality, gender diversity, education around consent and healthy relationships. And this is part 3 in that 3-part series. So thank you for joining us. In today's discussion, we hope to provide parents and carers and our young people some guidance about how to best support their intersectional needs of autistic students that also identify as LGBTQIA+. It is about the protective measures we can take to address their vulnerabilities that come with being neurodivergent, and the positive steps we can take to empower our young people. And thank you for being part of this, because we really do need to educate ourselves and continue to learn and foster a culture of openness, and especially through learning from the lived experience which we've brought to you today. So this brings me to our introductions for our 3 panellists who are here today to help us guide current and future generations. And we're so pleased to have them here. Before I quickly do the intros, just a note on the language around autistic identity and LGBTQIA+ identity. We always defer to the lived experience of the panel speakers themselves. And although we appreciate and acknowledge that terminology can be different for everyone, we have chosen to honour our panellists today. So let me first introduce you to Frances Brennan with their pronouns she, her. Frances is a speech pathologist and has been working with children and additional learning needs for over 10 years. Frances is also autistic and a member of the LGBTQIA+ community, and has been an amazing past panelist and part of our conference. So thank you so much, Frances. We're so glad to have you back. Thank you. Thank you. And we're really excited to also have Melody here. Welcome Melody back. Melody's pronouns are she, her, and Melody is an ADHD and autistic registered social worker, a relationship therapist and respectful relationships educator. Melody is an advocate and an LGBTQIA+ ally, and we're so pleased for you to join us today, Melody.
Thank you so much for having me.
Angie, and we've also got Angie Sipka with pronouns they, them. Angie is a queer autistic with ADHD. Angie is an advocate and lived experience speaker. And also welcome you back, Angie, because I know you're part of some videos we put together as a mashup on our conference, and you were so great. So thank you, Angie. Okay, so we're going to make sure that we can hear you all clearly. So thank you so much for that. But we're going to spend a large chunk of this hour-long panel with a discussion between our panelists on topics that are central to this conversation. For those in the chat, please feel free to share who you are, where you're from, what your background is, or why you're here today, maybe what you want to learn. We'd love to make this as interactive as possible. So please do share your thoughts in the comments. And then at the end of the hour, we've allocated some time to respond to audience questions that might pop up during the course of this session. So let's get into it. Autistic students, and more generally students with a disability, can face so many barriers when wanting to access safe information around sexuality and sexual identity. And it has been evidenced in research that by opening the dialogue around sexuality, we can help reduce the risk of complex mental health issues for young people and sexual violence. To have these conversations is the most effective protective measure that we can provide. Then keeping this conversation open, we can also help reduce the incidence of complex mental health issues, as I've said. And unfortunately, within this particular community, there are so many issues around suicide, suicidal ideation, self-harming, and we've talked about this in previous panels that we have to do better as a community. And we're here today to be part of that change, and these frightening statistics need to stop. So let's get started with question one. We're going to ask Melody first, and then we're going to hear from Francis and Angie. We would like to start the discussion by asking you, what advice do you give teachers and carers to better support autistic students that also identify as part of the LGBTQIA+ community?
Thank you, Katie. I think it's really important, as we've already mentioned, to acknowledge that there is a really strong overlap across both communities. We just had the gender discussion, and we know that trans individuals are 6 times more likely to also be autistic. And the numbers really vary in terms of sexuality, but what we do know for sure is that the overlap is significant. And we know, that there's a lot of need for intersectionality that considers both identities, that when people show up to school or public spaces, that they don't choose which one of their identities they want to turn up with, and when they try and access services, they're presenting as their whole selves. So we really need responses that are allowing individuals to define what that looks like for them. So it's also important to acknowledge and be aware of that. Unfortunately, we know that as minorities, and particularly young people who are part of multiple minority groups, that, as you said, they're more likely to experience multiple forms of bullying, social ostracisation, and discrimination. And again, we rarely see stats that reflect those overlapping identities, but we know individually both autistic and LGBT young people are the subject of stereotyping, prejudice, and abuse based on who they are. So I think the first thing that I would say to teachers and carers is that knowledge is power. I think having these conversations and really listening is very important. And the conversations that you have with young people are so important. I think as adults, we often underestimate the influence that we have by just being an accepting, understanding, open, safe space. And allowing young people to define and describe what their gender, their sexuality means to them. I wish it didn't need to be said in this space as well, but I think it's probably worth mentioning here that it's important to know what all of those letters mean, and that, allowing young people to build on that and use their own terms as well, getting familiar with and listening to the terms that young people are using to describe things like their sexuality, their gender identity, the language they use around autism or ADHD or any other, co-occurring identities that they relate to. The second thing that I would say is to remember that the rainbow and autistic experiences are both spectrums. And that's not on a scale of not much to very much, but more like vast constellations in a night sky. And there's many aspects to who people are as individuals. So, that can really only be defined by them. And the last thing I would say is to be strengths-based. So, allowing young people to talk about the things that are important to them, to feedback the positives that you notice about who they are, in terms of, including their gender and sexuality identities and traits of autism or ADHD, but also giving them space to, bemoan aspects or talk about aspects that they're not entirely sure about or comfortable with yet either, and have that space to really grow into themselves, I think is really important.
I love that point about growing into themselves is beautiful. And I think you're absolutely right that knowledge is power. And I feel so honoured that our audience today has chosen to be part of this conversation and listening, and seeing in the comments where everyone's from and their background. They're going to take this knowledge and cause a ripple effect with their communities. So thank you, Melody, for that really great nuanced answer. It's very, very good. And we'll learn a lot from that. Frances, might jump to you next.
I think mine actually comes second to yours really nicely, because I think the thing that I see as a clinician working with young people so often is that I think the duality, being autistic and a member of the LGBTQIA+ community, is so often I have parents and teachers say to me, I think they're confused, I think it's a phase, I think they're just copying so-and-so, they don't know what it means. And I'm sure this happens outside of like the autistic community as well, but I think people are so ready to, and we see it across the disability sector in general, in terms of like that apparently, once you've got a disability, you're expected to be asexual because, how can you be disabled and a sexual being? But there's this idea that the children or the young people don't know their own mind and don't know what they're feeling and don't know, how to express that. And so they're minimized and it's reduced and they're told it's not a thing. And sometimes I will even raise something with a parent and go, do you know what? I think this is part of who they are. And they'll tell me that it's not a thing. And so I think, the best thing that we can do as carers and educators and support people is actually, if a person is expressing themselves in any way, that we believe them to be the expert on themselves and what they're feeling and what they're experiencing. And we honour that and take that at face value. We don't doubt it or try and attribute it to something else, as something that I see come up time and time again. And I think that that's something really big that we could change, is to just believe people when they tell us who they are.
Yeah. Yes, no gaslighting. And I love we need to believe them because they are the experts on themselves. And I think let's put that up in lights, because as you said, with this intersection in particular, we question so much about, our thoughts and is that really true? So thank you, beautifully said. Thank you. Validating that for children is critical. Angie, we might jump to you next.
Awesome. So yeah, I think I'm going to be a build under that, because I'm not obviously a therapist or any sort of a clinician, but I, am in my late 20s now, which is weird to say. So I've been out of school almost 10 years, but I don't think it really ever goes away. The struggles that you have at school. I wasn't diagnosed until just over 2 years ago now, but I very much knew that I was, somewhere on the LGBTQIA spectrum in high school. I also attended an all-girls school, which stemmed from a lot of trauma in primary school. I think, honestly, it was the best decision that I went to an all-girls school. But again, I don't know how much of this was around 10 years ago, and I don't know if it's changed now, but we didn't have anything, wear it purple day and things like that. That didn't exist. There was really nothing in, part of the Catholic school community that showed that, hey, we actually are still allies of LGBTQIA people, even though we are a Catholic school. So a lot of my struggles stemmed from, being in an all-girls school that is, Catholic in nature, was quite religious. And then here's me trying to navigate, who am I? What am I doing? I was scared to come out to my parents. And even after I came out to my mum, it was kind of like, oh, no, that's not true. Or that's just a phase. It's just what you're into. I think I came out to her more times than I can even count. And in the end, she said, look, if this is true and it's real, then you can't speak about it. I need to accept it. And she came around, and she's probably the best person now, one of my greatest allies. But it was, not only trying to come out to my mum, but then also trying to come out to friends. That was also quite difficult. And I'm lucky that my friends were very accepting with that. But then being undiagnosed meant that I was bullied. I had little things that I was picked on for. I would say things, do things that would be a joke and people would laugh about for almost months afterwards. I struggled a lot in terms of maintaining friends, especially outside of school. No one really wanted to, I guess, when we had parties, we were a big friendship group. There was about 10 of us, and people in smaller groups would catch up outside of school, and I was never really part of those groups. And so I think being undiagnosed definitely led to that seclusion. And I always say I never really expected my parents to pick up on it. I think it very much 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't as well known, especially for parents, what symptoms and traits, I guess, so is in females. But I felt like teachers should have picked up. They were the ones that were seeing me day in, day out at school. They were seeing, no doubt, the struggles that I was having, the way that, I was sitting by myself and that I chose to do things by myself, the way that my work was presented, the way I would always be in the nurse's office or in a senior coordinator's office because it was too loud, it was too overwhelming. I couldn't get my homework done for XYZ reason again. And so I think a lot of my resenters, I felt like teachers should have picked something up, especially the ADHD. When I was diagnosed, the psychologist had no idea how I went undiagnosed for so long. I feel, teachers need to, I'm really glad that this is happening because, I'm not saying that I want to teach to go to my mum and say, your child's autistic, but just knowing, I guess, what to look out for and then being able to present it or even have the discussion around parents or other professionals and being able to get the help. Because I think that was, the hardest thing was not understanding why I was different and why people didn't like me and why they didn't want to be around me. So, I think we've still got a bit of a way to go, but I'm hoping that, things like this is showing that we're closing that gap slowly to hopefully help more and more students in the future.
Absolutely, you're spot on. And there will be so many teens or tweens facing exclusion and bullying, which can present as sudden mental health decline with anxiety or depression. And, that's something that we need to understand, that already our autistic community is facing these challenges of understanding one part of their identity, that there's, when we overlap the other, it's a very risky time. And it's really great to see that so many allies are here today joining in, and some of them are expressing their frustration being the only one, say, in a school environment that is, we hear you and we see you, and thank you for being part of that situation. And going back to what you were saying, Angie, around Catholic schools, I know my daughter attended a Catholic school and in grade 5 drew a pride flag and was told it's inappropriate. And I think that, unfortunately, not all schools are. There might be some, but not all schools are. And the only reason we were at a Catholic school is because we didn't have access to any supports at a mainstream school. And so that's where the risk happens, when there's autistic individuals having to access schools that might not be supportive of their queer culture, but they're supportive of the autistic needs. We've got to do something about that. It's not good enough. And thank you for highlighting your experience, because I know many will relate. Okay, so we do have a lot of questions to get through. We might jump to the next question. And we do also have resources that we're going to send our community, because as Melody said, knowing what the LGBTQIA+ actually stands for and some of that language that our younger people do know, please educate yourself if you're not across it. So question 2, evidence and research continues to show that certain group of students face increased risk factors. When it comes to matters such as bullying, exclusion, increased risk of sexual violence and complex mental health issues such as suicidal ideation and self-harming. We sadly continue to see this echoed in data around deaths by suicide, unfortunately, statistics showing higher rates with the autistic community and the LGBTQIA+ communities. So we need to develop a better understanding of the specific risk factors for autistic girls and gender diverse young people when it comes to navigating their sexuality and their identity and expression of this identity. So we're asking our panellists today to share their thoughts on why being neurodivergent, as well as being queer, might make them more vulnerable. And we might start off with Frances on this one.
This question has so many layers. And it's really hard for me to tease them out in terms of personal experience, because when it was happening, I lacked insight. And now I look back, you know, hindsight's 2020, and I've got so much extra information that, you know, I don't know where to sort of attribute things. But I guess the first thing that popped into my mind when I was thinking about this question, I spoke to my partner about it, and we talked about how, you know, we talk about the higher rates of suicide, and, you know, people talk about that casually and go, oh, it's because they were gay. They killed themselves because they were gay. And we were like, no, they didn't. They killed themselves because of how people responded to them being gay. And so I think that's something that we need to, you know, really highlight as well. It's not intrinsically because of being gay or because of being autistic. It's actually because of how they were received by the world. I guess for me in high school, I was definitely bullied. I didn't know I was autistic, and I didn't know I was gay. I was actually really late to the party on both of those things. I feel like potentially if you asked my peers, they would have been able to tell you both of those things about me. Maybe not labeling autistic, but definitely like, yeah, she's a bit different to us. But I do think when I looked at that question and I saw about the risk of sexual violence, I thought about some of the situations that I put myself in as a young person. And one of the things that I think about that is I didn't know I was gay. And so I assumed Angie, like you, was at a single-sex Catholic girls' school. And so what everyone was doing was dating boys. They were going out, they were going to parties, and they were doing things with boys. And so what did I do? I went to parties and I did things with boys. And did it feel good? No, but it didn't feel good because it turns out, like, I'm a massive lesbian, like love women, you know, didn't know that though. And so I kept putting myself in these situations. And even though it didn't feel good, I told myself, but that's what I'm meant to do. And so I was, you know, silencing my own voice about what felt good and what felt safe, and assuming that what I was doing was right. And so I just, you know, who would have known where that would have ended? How many situations would I have put myself in where I didn't feel comfortable? And, you know, when would that have stopped? I'm fortunate when I look back on it now that I had very, very strict parents, so I wasn't able to put myself in too many really risky situations. But I don't know how far I would have gone to be like the other kids, because I was not like them in every other way. And so if given an opportunity, you know, would I have slept with that guy at that party when I was 16? Maybe, I don't know. And the fact that it didn't feel good, I think I wouldn't have even realized that was not how it was meant to be.
Oh, so important, Frances, because as you've explained, there's so much ostracism, is that a word? So many of our members in our community are ostracized for being themselves because of their autistic identity, that they will attempt to do things to fit in any other way. And it is a risk. It's dangerous. And we see that.
I don't know whether it's, you know, we talk about just that reduced sense of self, or that later developing sense of self, I suppose, that can come. Sometimes there's that confusion. And I think, you know, I was literally like 18, 19 when I just had this moment where I was like, I'm gay. Okay, cool. And then, you know, it all started to fall into place. But all of those really like risky years, it wasn't even on my radar. So it wasn't even necessarily that I was hiding it. I just didn't know it. And I was just so busy trying to be like everyone else. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really important. And I might jump to Melody on this next part, because I know you've got some specific things you want to bring up in terms of research and stats on this.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to, in a big way, echo what you've just said, Frances, and you know, that we often hear about particular groups and mental health concerns as though it's intrinsic to the group, as though it's somehow, you know, this inherent thing that is inevitable, that can't be stopped, when we know that that's not the case. You know, all of the evidence tells us that, you know, even where genetically, say somebody might be predisposed to experiencing some mental health concerns, that it still needs those environmental triggers to activate those mental health conditions in somebody. And, you know, we can't really talk about mental health concerns in autistic young people, in queer young people, without also talking about power, you know. And so if you don't have positive representation, if everything says you don't quite fit in, who you are is not what you're supposed to be, you know, you're getting these derogatory representations of both groups and this sort of deficit lens, well, then it sort of makes sense that that goes with a whole lot of, you know, lack of safety, peer pressure, and, you know, all of the mental health concerns that happens with that. You know, and when we think about power, everywhere we go, and particularly in schools, particularly thinking about the media we consume, when we think about gender and sexuality education, relationships education, if we're lucky, and we're only just getting that off the ground in Victoria, you know, the focus is generally still very much on safety in terms of, you know, keeping yourself safe from STIs and, you know, protecting yourself against unwanted behaviour, but not so much around really what the purpose of having relationships and having sex is, which is you do it because it feels nice and you're connected to other people. So particularly for young girls, and particularly for a lot of gender diverse and sexually diverse young people, the messaging that they're getting is that sex is something that's done to them by boys, that it's not actually about them at all. And so you've kind of got this, you know, multifaceted, boundaryless environment that's saying, you know, this is how you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to do if you want to fit in. So, you know, for teachers, I think, you know, when we add in the role of teachers here, and coming back to this idea that teachers have a huge amount of power and influence and responsibility to advocate for both queer and autistic young people, we have to remember that that power is due to things like age and size and status and role, and that the things that are overlooked, the things that are not called out, whether they be from teachers or other students, actually really matter. And, you know, autistic and queer young people don't need somebody to save them because there's nothing wrong with them. But I think what's really needed is active bystanders and allies who are, you know, representing all young people, not just this particular one dominant social norm. Unfortunately, you know, I used to work in schools, and I've heard more vile, ableist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic comments come from teachers than from other students. And I've also witnessed, as I'm sure many teachers who do advocate and who are allies will relate to, a lot of other teachers and a lot of other school staff look on and minimise and excuse that behaviour. And there's such a power imbalance. If they're not going to speak up for young people, who is? You know, kids don't have a choice about going to school. They have to go to school every day. And it's such a massive part of life that does have the ability to shape their experience, you know, going forward, of course. So, you know, I think it's really important.
Melody, absolutely. What an incredible call to action for teachers and the community, and a culture shift that's needed about the power imbalance. I hope you're listening out there. I know we're preaching to the converted here today. Let's hope this gets into the hands of people that need to hear it and rethink what they're doing and the damage they're doing to this community. So thank you, Melody. Very powerful.
Add one more thing as well that I wanted to mention that I almost forgot. You know, when it comes to power as well, and particularly I know we've just talked a lot about gender in the previous panel discussion, you know, we can't talk about power and what's going on in queer spaces and autistic spaces without acknowledging the comparisons that I know a lot of people are advocating around the way particularly gay and transgender individuals have been treated by psychology and health professions, and what's happening with autistic young people and how they're being mocked, mistreated and pathologized right now. And I think that's really important to stand up against as well.
A double knockout there. Thank you. I hope all the allied health professionals and in the community are also listening. So thank you, Melody. Wonderful stuff. Angie, I'd love to hear from your lived experience.
Yeah, so I think this is obviously a really important thing to try and there's a lot to debunk, and I guess, as Francis and Melody were saying, that it's not just a really easy, this is what it is, this is how to fix it. I was saying before, I definitely knew I was, I guess, different from a young age, made clear, I guess, bullying through primary into high school, but I also knew I was gay from a young age. I think one of the first memory that I have was being 8, and for me as an 8-year-old, when there's really nothing in media, TV or around, it's very confusing. I didn't know what the feelings were. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't, I guess, break it down, and it's kind of, as the time went on, it's the way people would speak around me and the way, I guess, homophobia was around and presented, it made me feel a bit more unsafe as well. So I was like, oh, I feel this, but then this here is what I'm hearing and it's not safe, and I shouldn't be like this, and I'm wrong and I'm different. And it wasn't actually, I think, when I was watching the TV show Heroes, and it was, I think I was about 12, quite young to be watching it, but I watched it, and one of the main characters had kissed another girl, and I was like, it exists, like it's real. And it was like, oh my goodness. And that's when I was like, I think I finally understand, like I have it in my head. And it was a bit validating. Didn't make it any easier. Definitely still went through years of, listening to homophobia from not just family, but I guess media. And I think while we're still even for that, got a way to go, it's definitely getting much better. But I think, like I was saying, I think being at a Catholic school, it did shape a lot of who I am. And so there was definitely that anxiety then that came out, being, this is what we're learning, this is what we're being taught, and this is how I feel. And I was diagnosed with anxiety at 14, and it was depression at 15. And I did start self-harming at 15 as well, because what I didn't realize at the time is I was burnt out. I'd come home from school and it was just, all of these things that I was bottling up and I was trying to get through and I was trying to decode. I'd get home and I'm like, this is my safe space. And the struggles kept going and going, and it got harder and harder. And it was something I didn't tell anyone. It was why I went many trips to the nurse's office. I do put my hands down to the nurses. They were fantastic. But every single time they'd ask me the same thing: do your parents know? Or does someone you trust know? And I'd be like, oh, yeah, no, of course. They don't, they know, but they're not happy with it, but they know. And they were like, okay. And I could probably continued for close to 2 years, until one day it was a really bad day. And the nurse asked me again, she's like, I need to check again. Does someone know? And I broke down and I was like, no, no one knows. And they asked me, do you want us to tell your parents? And I kind of sat on it for a bit, and I actually ended up saying yes, because I wasn't going to. I didn't know how to. My mum always made it kind of clear that depression doesn't really exist in young people because we have it so easy, and it's not like when I was young, and if you had my troubles. So I didn't know how to tell her. And so the school ended up calling her, and she just happened to pick me up from school that day. I was staying late to study, and kind of sat in the car, and we didn't say anything. And about 10 minutes into the trip, she just looked at me and she's like, how can you be so stupid? And that was kind of it. And we really didn't speak about it again. We never really referenced it. She knew, but I guess, she didn't know. She'd ask about it every now and again, and I'd say, no, I'm not doing it anymore. It continued well on for the good half of 9 years, until I kind of understood that I had safer ways to express that built up burnt out that I had, and the frustration, and there were better ways to, I guess, when you're stressed, to not just go to what my default was in high school. But it was very much that I always thought that it was because I was gay and that I didn't fit in. But now that I'm diagnosed, I can look back and I think a lot of that, I was different, but it was the different that I didn't realize that it was actually contributing to all of the depression and the anxiety that then made me feel like that I wasn't worth being on the space of this earth, which I always say I'm really grateful then I kind of had I found where I belonged, and I realized that I'm actually way more worth than all of those memories in high school and all the things that people said and did. But it's hard because I don't know how I would have wanted my mum to support me, because I didn't have that support. I don't know what it would have looked like. I kind of made do, and I had my own ways to cope with it. But even, it's another thing that teachers never picked up on. Teachers never noticed, and there was never really any, I guess, referencing or talking about it. There were never ways that teachers would be like, if you're feeling X, Y, Z, this is what we can do. Let's practice mindfulness. Let's practice writing things down. There was never any ways that, we were kind of taught to, I guess, be, it's so, I know that a lot of people self-harm, and I know that a lot of teenagers still do, as to whether schools are actually now, not directly saying that if you want to do X, you have to do Y, but even just in terms of anxiety and in depression, what can we be teaching students, I guess, without giving them, being like, this is what you're doing, this is what you do, but how can we tell them that we're here to listen. Here, remember, you can see the counsellor. There's no shame in seeing. I saw the counsellor for almost all of school because that was free and it was accessible, and I got to miss out on boring classes. But what can we be doing? And then what can we be, I guess, sending home or providing parents as well? What can they look out for at home? And I think it needs to be collaborative. I think if teachers are doing one thing and parents aren't, or vice versa, there's still going to be, I guess, inconsistencies with how students feel that they're supported both in home and at school.
Yeah, absolutely, Angie. And I think your reference about, thank you for sharing your journey with your mum, because, hopefully when parents know better, they do better. And there's a lot of cultural expectations. There's family, there's intergenerational trauma. There's a lot of issues, religious schooling environments that lead to this increased risk factors around young people needing to mask, which feeds into the mental health risks, as you've just given as an example. Regional students might have less access to support networks. There's so many factors in play. And, we talk a lot about connection as being truly authentic connection being one of the most important things parents and teachers can do. And my children go to a community school where teachers are on a first name basis. They get to know their students. It's authentic, it's real, and students can tell the difference. And I just wish more schools would do that. So thank you, Angie, for that input. It's extremely helpful. We're going to jump to question 3 though, because we've got so many great questions, and those in the chat, don't forget you can put in questions for when we get to it. So now we want to look at, actually, I just talked a bit about the protective measures connection, what we can do to suggest to schools, teachers, parents and allies to support students. What are your thoughts around how schools can implement meaningful and inclusive supports to help reduce the isolation, the bullying, the stigma for this particular cohort, and ensure that's delivered consistently across school? We might go to Melody first on this one.
I think Angie just hit the nail on the head and just summed this up so beautifully in the previous question. We can't underestimate the impact of having to mask all day at school. I related so much of what you said, Angie, around I was a terrible one for forcing myself to feel sick so I didn't have to go to school after school holidays. And what I now realized was that I was exhausted. I loved school, I loved learning, but I was coming home and I was exhausted. So after the holidays, I never wanted to go back. So I think something that's really unfortunate is that often when we talk about accessibility and we talk about inclusion, we want to take these, and I'll preface this by saying I'm a social worker who likes to disrupt things. We want to take these really rigid environments and institutions, and we want to not change them in any way and just add on a little something sprinkled on the top for autistic or for LGBT young people and think that that will do, and it doesn't do. We actually have to disrupt the things that aren't working altogether. And these institutions are often so resistant to broader accessibility, as if that doesn't actually benefit everybody. I remember when I was working in a school and a youth worker complained to me, an autistic person, one day, that now that some autistic young people had fidget toys in the classroom, that now everybody wanted them and everyone was using them. And I was like, okay, if that makes it easier for everybody to focus, if everyone feels more relaxed and engaged fidgeting, okay, like that's a good thing. I don't care. So yeah, I think bearing in mind that accessibility and inclusion actually really benefits everyone. And the other thing that I would say that's really important, coming from my social worker background, coming from a rights perspective, is that teachers really need to advocate to enshrine this stuff into their school policies. Put it in the policies, because otherwise it's not going to happen. It needs to be in your standard recruitment. It needs to be in your induction and ongoing training processes for teachers and staff, so that everyone has the same information, has that same base level understanding. And also sometimes schools have these things in their policies, but the students don't know. So the second part of that is that, you know, ensuring that students understand what their rights are. I'm all for going into schools and getting them lobbying and, you know, being little activists together and joining forces. And I think, you know, that's a role that teachers could play. It doesn't need to come from outside. That would be a really powerful thing that teachers could do. And the last thing I would say, because I see this all the time, we really need to advocate for kids who either haven't got a diagnosis yet, or because of, you know, prohibitive factors like costs and wait lists and all of those things, are unable to get a diagnosis. It's a really sad, unfortunate thing that we know that a lot of people are either late diagnosed or not diagnosed at all. And in the meantime, they've got nothing, and that's really not okay. So that's a really important factor, and I think that we can do that too, alongside, you know, obviously challenging your own biases and assumptions as well.
Absolutely. Too many good points to list. I can't wait to go back and look at our live tweets on all those points. So thank you, Melody. Frances, what's some protective measures that we can suggest to schools, teachers and parents to support students?
So I know, Katie, this is something that you and I in various forums have talked about. You know, it's a question we come back to every time because it's just not being done well. And I think, you know, if we're looking at in general supports for autistic people, autistic students, there's just so many things. So I think today I'm going to really try and hone it in on those, the things that we can do to support in terms of sexual identity for any student, but particularly the extra vulnerable autistic students as well. I think for me, and I don't know how feasible this would even be in a Catholic school system at the moment. I like to believe that maybe it's done better in schools that aren't, you know, anchored in religion. But I think we need to be, you know, sex education can't just be one time. It can't just be year 9, because not everyone's ready. It's not relevant. Some people, like, they've missed the boat. It needed to be earlier. Some people, it needed to be later. It wasn't relevant for me in year 9. I probably didn't pay much attention to it. And when we do sex ed, it's like the dark side of sex ed. Like, here's all the STDs you can get. And that's like STIs, I think we call them now. But that's what you get in sex ed. And also, here's how you make a baby. So these are the two things. Like, you don't want to have sex because you're probably going to get an STI or end up with a teen pregnancy. And that's pretty much what I got in terms of sex ed at school. But there was nothing about relationships, respectful relationships, why people have sex, all of those sorts of things, the different ways that people can have sex. And obviously it's all got to be age appropriate. But I think just recognizing that there isn't just this one way that people have sex. Sexual activity is not just one thing. Why we engage in sexual activity with people and who those people might be, and how you want to feel when you're engaging with that person. It's something that I do in sessions with young people, and quite often, you know, when we go to, we're all fortunate enough that, you know, we've been through sort of mainstream schooling and had these things, but I actually work with a lot of young people that have been in specialist education settings. I had a young person recently who he fancies someone. He's 19. This guy's 19. And he wants to ask this young lady out on a date. So we've been going through, well, how do you know when you're ready to start a relationship with someone? Have you got time? Are you ready to focus on that person and their needs as well as your own? All of those things. And then I said to him, what do you think you might do on a first date? Thinking that he'd say like 10-pin bowling or the movies or something. And he goes, have sex. And I was like, whoa, all right, let's go back a little bit here. And no one had done sort of any of what it means to be in a relationship before that, when it is the right time for you, when it is, you know, and who that person's going to be. And unfortunately, once we did, I sent home some handouts and some things to look over with mum and dad. And he was told, oh, just steady on, mate. Maybe you can just be friends. And I was like, Okay, he's 19. So I think in terms of protective measures, I think we owe it to young people to have really honest conversations around, educating them, in the mechanics, but also in the relationships and what it means, and how to know when maybe you're ready to take that step with someone. And I feel like that's lacking a little bit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Even your example there just is a classic example. So many people might benefit from explicit instruction, but at various stages. It's such a good point. And I never even thought about that. It's so like you hit year 8, you get the conversation and it's not discussed again.
Yes.
So very, very good point. Thank you so much. Angie, we might jump to you next on these protective measures.
Well, I think what Francis and Melody were saying are both great, and I think I'm going to go down a little bit of a different rabbit hole into the education system. So obviously I was saying I had a lot of anxiety and then also the depression in high school. Obviously my parents did note that, but that was also evident in high school, in the sense that I was always in the coordinator's office being like, yeah, I couldn't finish my work. I'm finding it too hard. I struggle to study, all these reasons. And career counselling was something that was really pushed on us. We sat down and we had to, before we even started VC, being, what are you going to do at uni? You got to pick your course. What are you going to do? You got to do the subjects, do what you need. And it was, I know now it's VC vocational major, but at the time it was VCAL, and our school offered VCAL, and it was very stereotypical. It was for the dumb kids. It was, for those that didn't want to be at school. And if it was something you mentioned that were like, oh, I'm interested in VCAL, they'd be like, you're smarter than that. You don't need to do VCAL. And I struggled. I ended up doing 2 higher studies pre-year 12, so I only had 4 subjects to lessen the load. It was still hard. No matter how much I studied, I struggled to retain information, which obviously ADHD gay. But exams, sitting through 3 hours of exams and trying to write, I didn't realize I was diagnosed. I struggled with English and persuasive writing, and, read this article. How do the people feel? And I'd be like, angry. That's not appropriate term to use. I'm like, I don't know how they feel. They're either happy, sad, or angry. Like, that's the 3. And I didn't realize that because I'm autistic that I don't understand emotions. And so I struggled. So when you're sitting in an exam and you're like, this is my final score, you're like, I don't understand. It was hard. But not once was VCAL ever suggested to me or to others I know who would have benefited from them, because I guess a school's success is measured in their VCE scores and how many students get into a university and finish with a good ATAR score. But what they don't realize is that the process of actually getting these good ATAR scores to make schools look good, it actually breaks a lot of kids. I ended up, finishing high school, getting into uni. I went for 3 weeks. I found it was worse than high school. I dropped out. And I now own a business in nothing that I actually studied at school, nothing that I studied at uni, but actually what I did as volunteering and community participation. So I did in my free time, I turned that into now what I run as a business. And VCAL would have probably helped with that, in helping me get a certificate, helping with more of those life skills. Don't teach me trigonometry and maths. I still can't do 5 + 3 in my head. I have to use my fingers, like the basic things that I never really got taught how to do. And so I'm a big advocate. I've, helped my cousin in understanding, and I explained to her parents why VC versus VCE vocational major, why you don't need to do VCE, why it's not the be all end all, that you can still go to university. Why go straight into university right after high school when you're already struggling with the workload?
Absolutely, Angie. I think that's such a good point. Yeah, I'm glad you're able to then use what you've learned to help your cousin, and I think it's really great. We have got so many questions and we're getting close to time, so I might jump into some of the questions that have come out. Thank you for answering those questions, and obviously keep them coming in the audience. So we've got a question about, it's a really interesting question actually. How do you best support students in a situation where the parent inquiry leads to parents, the legal guardian, demand that the school not allow the student to express or display their wish to be gender diverse, and or convinced they are angry with the child for even bringing that up. I know we're here to talk about sexual diversity, but I guess it's similar question if we could frame it around what do we do when the school wants to support the child, but the parents resistant, and it's more common than we expect. So Melody, do you want to jump to that one, and then Frances?
Yeah, it is so common. And I think I don't know what's happened in this particular situation, but I think there's a step before that where, where a child is coming out at school and there has to be a conversation around, it can't just be presumed that you're coming out to the entire school if you're coming out in a particular group or a particular classroom. And that applies for whatever you're coming out with, whether it's being autistic, whether that's being gender diverse or sexuality. And then, including in that, who are your safe people? Who do you feel comfortable to talk to? And having conversations around helping young people to think about what feels comfortable for them. And of course, still you might have it happen where a young person says, yeah, great, I'd love to tell my parents, and then their parents aren't supportive. But I think it really does have to come back to how do you support that young person in that space to identify as much as they can in a safe way and protect them when they're going home. Like, I think you have to. I don't know. I'm keen to hear what others.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Frances. Do you have any specific info on this one?
I'm going to try and tell this really, really quickly. But so 2 things that came to mind. Very early on in my career, I diagnosed a young boy as autistic. And I remember his mother looked at me and she had teared up and she said, oh, I'd rather him be autistic than gay. And I was like, how are those 2 things? Like, what? I then said some choice words and actually got in trouble for my boss. But I recognise now that the reason that came up is because those are 2 really significant fears for parents when they don't understand, and that was a fear response. And I take that and I think about when I came out to my own parents, and I remember telling my father, and he put his head down in his hands. And I remember he rubbed the top of his head and then he got up and he walked to his office. And I'm going to try not to cry when I say this, but I followed him and I sat down in his office and I said, I'm still the same person I always was, Dad. I haven't changed. And he looked at me and he said, I know, but the world isn't going to be kind to you. And that was what he was worried about. So I think we need to have that unconditional positive regard for parents. It's so easy for us to be like, what pigs, let that person be who they are. We don't actually know where that response is coming from. And so I think if we meet them with kindness and try and educate them, try and give them an opportunity to hear the perspective of the young person, we might get somewhere. Not always, but slow and steady. So many of us that come out talk about how shocked our parents were at first and how they become allies. And I think we've got to try and give parents time and assume they love their child. They wake up every day wanting to do the best for their child. And this is a time where they're struggling to know what's right and how to do that.
That is really so gentle and a lovely response, Frances. And I know there might be multiple issues, like you said, cultural expectations that they've grown up with, those kind of barriers. They might be, neurodivergent themselves, so struggling with change, or rigid in their own thinking somewhat. It's so much complexity to it. And I think that's a beautiful response. Angie, did you want to answer this one? And then we'll finish up on a question on asexuality.
Yeah, so I guess, similar to Frances, and I know how that can feel. When my mum finally came around and we sat down and we spoke about it, she said the reason that she was so, I guess, resistant to hearing about it and wanting to know, because, she had the same fear. She was like, how are you going to have kids? How are you going to get married? Like, what's going to happen? Like, are you going to be treated the same? And, will you be able to share the same things? Like, can you both be in a home alone? And I said, well, yes, probably. But even if not, like, that's for me to worry about. That's not for you. I love that she stresses and understanding, but I said, that's not a reason for you to think that you can't be supportive of me. And so I think, if you have to unsupportive, being school is unsupportive, and obviously home may not be the most supportive place either. I think it's where a child may really struggle. I think home at the end of the day is, I think, the best place for a supportive environment to be, because family is what hopefully a child stays with, whereas school, you can come and go. And so even if a school isn't supportive, and they may not be able to budge or kind of willing, I think when the family there are supportive and able to step up, the child still knows, well, hey, I go here and I can't really be who I am, but I can go home and I have people that love me. And I think at the end, that's the most for a child to know that they still have a sense of belonging. And, you know, yeah, I think where they go, if they don't fit in, it's not, you know, it's not on them. It's that other perspectives that need to change. And hopefully little advocates can come out of it.
Thank you, Angie. And I know we've got in the comments someone saying that you came out to your mum more than once has really got them thinking, and they hadn't considered that for some, they may need to continue those conversations with friends and family until they're able to process, accept the information. It's a really, really interesting perspective. So thanks for sharing that. And all these answers to questions have been incredible. We will finish up on one last question. I might direct it to you, Melody, and then Francis and Angie, if you've got specific comments around it. But the question is, we don't often hear about asexuality much when we talk about LGBTQIA+, and being autistic, I am asexual, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on how to better support that particular cohort at schools.
Oh gosh, we just need better respectful relationships and sexuality education to begin with, don't we? Like, it's a whole topic that we could spend, gosh, hours just talking about and unpacking. Yeah, I think we just really need education that actually acknowledges the diversity of relationship experiences, and like particularly for autistic people, what different types of relationships can and might look like. And there's no right or wrong way to have a relationship, but around, you know, rights and relationship values and boundaries and what you would like it to look like. So I think that's one part, which kind of, you know, to some extent might include that aromantic or asexual identities for some people. And then the second part, yeah, is around sexuality, and the same thing, that, you know, sexuality is not necessarily a fixed thing. It's not necessarily, you know, something that's easily defined. It's not necessarily binary. You know, there's a whole facet of experiences in there around, you know, breaking down the differences between things like romantic attraction, who you would like to have a relationship with, if you'd like to have a relationship with them. You know, we say sexuality, but what we actually mean is this whole spectrum of details. You know, it's a broader umbrella with a lot sitting underneath it. So things like attraction, things like your sexuality, and actually, you know, how you want to have sex, who you want to have sex with, who you want to have relationships with, yeah, what feels good for you, all of those things, the types of overlap between your sexuality and your relationships. Like, we need to be having conversations around that and emphasizing that it's not something that we just do. We don't just have sex to have babies. As has already been mentioned, you know, we have relationships for a whole range of reasons, and we have sexual relationships or not, or, you know, sexual relationships with ourselves, relationships with ourselves that can look very different as well. And that's really important for young people to understand, and that, you know, ultimately our bodies are for ourselves first and foremost.
Oh, so spot on, Melody. And I think there's so much language to understand, especially for maybe those of us who haven't been part of, as allies, part of the community. You've listed off some, you know, aromantic, and there's a lot of areas that we need to better educate ourselves on so that we can support our young people in this. And I loved your point around the fluidity of sexuality and understanding that it can change over time, and we just need to be there to support our young ones through that journey, whatever it may look like, and validate and accept that. So thank you. Is there any particular points, Francis and Angie, you want to make to that asexuality question? Angie?
Sorry, I'll quickly just jump in. I think, yeah, I don't know if I just blocked it out. I don't really remember sex education in high school. Again, Catholic education, I'm sure it probably wasn't what I needed, and it would have been very one-sided. But I think even in that scope, though, you can be teaching, I guess, yeah, what is a healthy relationship, and that you don't have to do X, Y, Z to be in a healthy and a, you know, happy relationship. And so I think, yeah, Catholic schools, I'm hoping, can move from that shift, and I'm hoping government and community schools are already there. I think it's also important to remember that asexuality can still go with a gender identity as well, and with obviously sexuality. So at one point, and I was questioning everything in high school, I did say to my mum, I said, oh, I'm thinking maybe I might be asexual. Like I didn't understand. I obviously wasn't like, I just didn't know what I was feeling. And I was one of the things, and the first thing my mum said was, she was like, oh, well, if that's the case, then, well, she can still get married to a man. Obviously, this was before we came around to it all, but it was like, well, no, I can still be asexual and gay. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm suddenly straight and asexual. So I think it's just important to remember that asexuality can also occur within, I guess, yeah, various gender identities and also sexual identities as well.
Good point there. Thank you so much. Frances, did you want to jump on, and then I'll read a few quotes?
Just really quickly, Katie, which Angie, you've kind of touched on, there's sexual attraction, and then there's actually wanting to engage in sexual activity with another person. And I think the really like unsexy thing that hasn't been talked about is all of the actual like sensory input that you get when you're engaging in sexual activity with someone, that can at various times for people, you know, we talk about overload, we talk about burnout, but there are times when that might actually be too much, and you're too aware of maybe, you know, some of the things that actually just make it actually a really confronting experience. And so I think that's something that's sort of unique to our community as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. And I think it's good if we can model that, even if, you know, we say, I don't like sleeping in the same bed as, you know, my partner because it's too much for me, and we model different relationships and have those conversations to normalize that every relationship can look the way it is, and how important it is to have that self-acceptance. So thank you for bringing that particular point up. And there are a few points I've put on screen. We did go out to our community before this panel and got some quotes, and there's one on coming out, which says, as an autistic queer young person, I have 2 closets I feel I need to come out of, and both were hard. Coming out for me was extra challenging because I'm autistic and already find communication and reading emotions difficult. Generally not knowing who I was able to trust with that information was hard, and without a strong group of friends around me, I couldn't really go to anyone for advice. And I was lucky our school was a safe place for me to begin this conversation through explicit events and dialogue. I was able to show the world who I really am. That's a really interesting point. And I think many of the members in our panel today talked about things like, what day is it? Purple. Yeah, we're at Purple Day. Yay to that, for having that conversation. But all of the Pride events are super important. And I did want to also just quickly touch on the finding safe places where for neuroqueers, and letting teenagers know that just because they are at that intersection of being autistic and queer, you don't have to like everything that the queer community love, like parades and pride and loud noises and sensory overwhelm, that you can find your safe place as well within that. And hopefully at Yellow Ladybugs, that's what we will continue to develop. But hopefully other organisations and community events accept that and understand that. And lastly, sorry, just finishing up on the autistic and the asexual comment. One of the quotes was that I've always been confused by attraction, and as I entered my teens, when I felt like I was already a misfit, I was the odd autistic girl. I hated the constant conversations my friends were having around their relationships and sex, and I thought something was wrong with me. And because asexuality is often overlooked and not spoken about, it really made me feel further ostracized. And I guess that could be for any part of the spectrum of sexuality. I wish parents, schools, and even the community in general recognised and discussed this more. And I just wish more people around me offered explicit, open lines of communication so I could have explored this with a safe validation. So I think all those comments and everything you've shared today, our amazing panellists, hopefully gives some food for thought on this topic. Any last comments from Frances? Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your beautiful lived and very sometimes hard lived experience, but may that be a guide for the current and next generation, and the legacy that you are leaving is just chef kiss. Thank you so much. Melody, thank you for bringing your incredible insights as a professional to this conversation today. Again, I could listen to you all day, and you are an incredibly pow advocate. And I think we're going to definitely get some of your comments written up so people can share that with their community. And Angie, thank you so much. Your lived experience, your real authentic way of expressing yourself so many of us will relate to, both as a parent hearing your mum's journey through this and your journey. It's so validating to hear in your lived experience. And thank you for listening. It means you're an ally. It means you're open to listening. But what I need you to do is go and share this information. When you see it back on our socials, please share so that we can continue to amplify these incredible voices. Thank you, Francis, Melody, and Angie from Yellow Ladybugs, and thank you all for attending.